Uh, and I would like to start with that, and I'll try to keep that reasonably short, maybe half an hour, hopefully within that framework, maybe a little longer. And then both my wife and I have both been involved in Myanmar over the last 25 years. And so she's on with me tonight, and I'll give a little bit of information about what she's been doing, what I've been doing, and give her a chance to share some of her experiences, which are in a very different area of engagement than mine. And also, then I'd like to just open it up for conversation, see what issues you'd like to go into deeper discussion about. So let me begin by screen sharing my presentation. There we go. Okay, I hope that you can see that. So I've entitled this this presentation, Myanmar Crisis and Courage, because I think those are the two most important words to understand the context that this country is facing right now. Myanmar has been in crisis many times over its history, but the recent crisis began on February 1st, 2021, when the military basically pulled a coup on the election that took place in November of 2020 and took over the management of the country. And the response of the people has been not to accept the coup, not to be compliant or complacent about it. And the three fingers single symbol that is raised there is a symbol of resistance of the people to the coup of the military to take back the control of the management of the entire country after having relinquished it in a democratic transition that took place in 2010, a very short time ago, after many years of military management of the country dating back really to the coup of 1962, when Ne Win took over from a democratically elected government and installed a military regime that has ruled all the way up until 2010. And I'll go a little bit into the history later, but this is a country that's been struggling with its identity in the modern world following World War II and a long period of colonial domination by the British, who ruled Myanmar or Burma in those days in a divide and rule approach. And they divided the country's administration and political relationships among the different ethnic groups and kept them separated from one another. And at the end of World War II, when they negotiated their independence from Britain, they tried to find a way to be a country together. And there are I think there are 129 different ethnic minorities who comprise the population of this country. So it represents an enormous challenge of integration of these different groups into a coherent nation state. And there's been crisis after crisis as they've tried to find their way out of their history into a modern world. And in the current environment with this coup from the military, the courage of the people to stand up against it and not be complacent is a hallmark that is very different than their experience under military leadership in earlier years. So what I'd like to talk a little bit about tonight is a little bit about my involvement with Myanmar and also Kitty's involvement. Then I'll talk about what precipitated the coup on February 1st, the sort of background of that. What have been the responses of the people, the military, the international community to what's happened there in the last year? What have been the major developments in the recent months and the dynamics of change at work in that country that are going to influence a path forward from where they are today? I'd like to touch on the deeper story and the deeper historical context of the challenges of nation building that are the sub narrative of understanding what's at stake in today's situation. and then talk what are the major factors that will affect the unfolding confrontation, and ask the question, is there a path towards reinvention of the state? Were they going to retreat back into a military-dominated and isolated country as they were for so many years? So let me just begin with a little bit about my own background and Kitty's. And I don't know whether you can see the full photograph. It's not easy on my screen here. Oh, sorry, wait a minute. Let me start with the photograph on the right. And if you can see it on the very far right bottom corner, there's one woman in a group of Myanmar Anglican priests. And that's my wife, Kitty, in 1994, who was invited to attend the consecration of a classmate of hers at Virginia Theological Seminary, which is an Episcopal seminary where they were both studying. And she went on to become an Episcopal priest here in the US, and he went on to become an Anglican bishop. And he invited her to join his consecration in 1994, and she was the first Anglican or Episcopal priest they'd ever met. And they just fell in love with each other, and they've been in a relationship that's lasted very significantly ever since that first trip. And she visited that country almost virtually every year from 1994 up until the advent of COVID. And I think our last trip was in 2019. And she's taken many trips there, visited many parts of the country in places that most foreigners aren't allowed to get into, has many friends, and has worked hard to help them find their way into a more modern world and to engage with the outside world, get support, to bring American students to learn what it means to be Christian in a Buddhist country, and to cope with the consequences of the coup, and she's been in Facebook contact with them almost every day in the last year. And I'll give her a chance to share some of that experience with you a little later. In my case, because I was at the World Bank, I was working not at the grassroots level, but at the level of the higher level government, economic, and then later political issues facing the country. And it started in 1988 when I visited as a division chief for education and health, because we had just been through a reorganization of the bank, and Myanmar had been shifted from being called a South Asian country to a Southeast Asian country. And I worked in the Southeast Asian area, and all of a sudden I was given responsibility for our relationship in the areas of education and health. And I went to visit just at the moment when there was this feeling of opening up, emerging in Myanmar after all the years of isolation, because the military dictator Ne Win was getting old and had basically announced that he was going to step down. And there was this feeling at that time in early 1988 that there was going to be change in the country that would make life better for everybody. So I had this absolutely wonderful visit, and I went home with a great big long list of things they wanted us to do in education and health to help them expand their relationships with the outside world and to improve the social conditions in the country. And I sort of went home to my bosses with a memo and said, look, I've come back with the bacon. We've got a job here. And then over the summer, there was a transition, and Ne Win stepped down, but another military government took over, and they called themselves the State Law and Order Council, otherwise known as SLORC. And all of a sudden, the country was put back under military leadership, but in a different orientation. And there was a student uprising in the fall of 1988 that all of a sudden unleashed the feelings of the younger population that they wanted to get out from under the repression of the military and have a different future. And there were elections called for 1990. Aung San Suu Kyi, who had been the daughter of the father of the country, Aung San, but who had studied in India, and she had married a Brit and had British children. She was back taking care of her mother and decided she was going to stick around and develop a relationship with the National League for Democracy and challenge the military in the elections of 1990. which they won and which were then repudiated by the military. And it's been a downhill story ever since. And I'll come back to that later. So my initial enthusiasm was squashed by the events of the remaining years. And that was sort of all I was able to accomplish in an early phase. Later, when Kitty and I lived in Bangkok and opened the World Bank office in Hanoi in 1994, and I came back to Washington in 1997 after working on the opening up of Vietnam, and there was a reorganization of the bank, and they decided they would make me a country director for Myanmar, even though we weren't allowed to do anything there because of the military situation, and they'd been a member since 1954. And we had a lending program there up until the mid 1980s. So I was put in charge of a country we couldn't do anything in. But I managed to work with our staff and with the IMF and with the government to produce the first poverty report ever prepared for Myanmar, to really bring the understanding of the nature of poverty in the country, the extent of poverty, into the agenda, because all of the interactions of the international community were around human rights and democracy, and no one was talking about their economic situation and the social and poverty issues that the country was facing. We tried to bring that out into the open. Then they made the mistake of deciding that they were going to get our attention by not paying us back on our loans. And I had to deal with the issue of what it means when a country goes into default on international borrowing, which I can tell you is not a good idea. But that managed to get me to visit Myanmar and have a chance to talk to them face to face in the period that I was working there. And then when I left the bank in 2000, because I wanted to get involved in things that I couldn't do as a World Bank person, I was hired as a consultant by the UN to work with the country team on a humanitarian strategy, and then later was asked to be the economic advisor to the UN special envoy responsible for political dialogue on Myanmar under the good offices of the Secretary General, which brought me right into the political process in the leading up to the elections of 2010. But my role there was to bring the poverty and the economic dimension of this into the list of things that people were focusing on, and I've been involved ever since in various ways. So let me just set that aside for background. So as we look at the coup itself, the context for this really began in 2003, when the number two person in the military government, named Kim Nund, made a statement that the military had adopted a 7-step roadmap that would take them to democracy. And so that was the first sign that the military was ready to find a way to move down a democratic transition process. And that roadmap was basically in these phases. The first was to reassemble a national convention that had been suspended since the mid-1990s to talk about what kind of a democracy they wanted to shape, and then to implement the task for founding a democratic system, to implement what the National Convention had determined what kind of a system they wanted. The third phase was to draft a constitution that would be consistent with all of that. And the fourth phase was to hold a national referendum to endorse the Constitution. And the fifth phase was to hold free and fair elections. And the sixth phase was to convene a meeting of the elected representatives. And the seventh phase was for those representatives to elect the government, the leaders, the president, vice presidents, and the key leadership of the government, which were not elected by the people directly. They were elected by the representatives in the new parliament. Now, the problem with the roadmap was it had no deadlines, and people weren't sure how quickly this would unfold, and there were a lot of concerns about how inclusive that process would be, and it turned out not very inclusive, and it was something that the military kind of railroaded through until they adopted a constitution in 2008 that had provisions in it which were, I would say, largely objectionable to the NLD. One of them was that 25% of the seats in both the upper and lower houses of parliament were reserved for military appointees. And the second was a provision that said any person who is married to a foreigner or has foreign children is not permitted to be president of the country. That was clearly aimed at Aung San Suu Kyi, who had married Michael Harris and had 2 British children. In any case, they adopted the Constitution and railroaded it, and then held elections in 2010. In the first election, Suu Kyi was still under house arrest, and the NLD, bottom line, decided not to participate. So they held the election anyway, and in those elections, the party that was representing the military interests was called the Union Solidarity and Development Party, the USDP, and there were 40 parties that had been registered by the National Election Commission to participate in this election. Most of them were small parties that were linked to various ethnic groups, because the election was not just for national offices, it was also for state level offices. And each of the ethnic areas wanted their own parties to be able to run and for legislative and administrative roles in their own homeland areas. And the only 2 parties of any national character were the USDP for the military and the NLD, but the NLD didn't run. So in the end, for that first election, the military won 80% of the vote. And the second largest vote taker was from the Shan state, the Shan Nationality Party, but they had hardly any seats. And so that first elected government in 2010 was made up of the 25% of the military people in the parliament plus 80% of the other seats. So they had total control over what was going to happen. Now, the other thing that was interesting about this is that when under the Constitution, if you're elected a member of the parliament, but then you're then elected to be a government official by the parliament, like a president or vice president or any of the major ministries, et cetera, then you have to resign from the parliament in order to take up those government positions, a separation of responsibility. So when the military government made those determinations, all of the military who were elected to form the government had to leave the military and take up civilian clothing, and there were 40 of them. And the president was a former general, named Chen Sen. That left 40 vacancies that had to be filled. And so while the military under Chen Sen formed a new democratically elected government, they had to set up a by-election in 2012 to fill the remaining 40 vacancies. And by then, both the NLD and the international community, who had not been able to supervise the 2010 elections as foreign visit supervisors, they were allowed to do that. And the NLD decided they would contest those 40 seats, and they won 39 of them. So all of a sudden, the NLD found itself a small player, but actually participating in the parliamentary process, and Suu Kyi was elected in that election. One thing I would say about the military government is they did a lot better than most outsiders expected. Chen Sen actually ended up being a very sensible president, I would say, trying to move the needle forward in terms of doing real things for the people and respecting the interests of the people, and getting a team put together, not only in his administration, but advisors to help guide them in their thinking about economic restructuring and things. And some of the people that I got to know, younger, economically oriented Myanmar people who were part of the resistance movement earlier, they were willing to work with the new government to try to help them do the better things for the people. And And I was really surprised by that, but they were working behind the scenes to help them succeed in making democracy more meaningful for the people. And Thein Sein did one thing that really caught everybody's attention, because the Chinese wanted to build a dam up in the upper Irrawaddy River, where it came out of China and into Myanmar, so that they could have an electricity dam that would take all the electricity, and take it to China. And this was very unpopular among the population, because the Irrawaddy is a major river system in the country, and many people depend on the water flow for their livelihoods. And Thein Sein put the kibosh on the agreement with the military that the earlier military government had made with the Chinese for the dam. And that made the Chinese mad as hornets, but it gave him some real popular support by the people, who recognized that he was actually willing to do things that they really felt strongly about. And I think that first administration has not been given, I think, the respect of what they tried to do and what they were able to accomplish, because they were a military government, as everyone was focusing on how the transition to NLD leadership could actually take place in a very different way. So by the time there was a second election in 2015, the NLD was more prepared to participate actively in the preparation for that, and they ran, and they won a resounding victory. They got 86% of the seats in the election. And Suu Kyi was named to be foreign minister, because she wasn't allowed to be named president, because she had British children. So in order to give her more authority, they decided to name a colleague of hers the president, but then to create a new position called state counselor, that would be kind of the equivalent of a prime minister, who had authority beyond what a president would have, in order to give her the primary position of leadership in the government that took place after that election. So the NLD ran the country for the next 5 years, and I think there were 91 parties that were signed up to participate in that election. Again, largely because of the state level elections that were going along with this. But the problem is that during that period between 2015 and 2020, they ran into some real issues. One of the issues was the whole issue of the Rohingya, and the effort by the military to suppress the Rohingya. There were claims of genocide. They were taken to the International Court in The Hague. And Suu Kyi, as the leader of the country, went to The Hague and defended the country and defended the military in the public arena for their behavior and the way they related to the Rohingya. And this was a major shock to most of the international community, because they saw her as the icon of democracy and human rights. And here she was standing up for the military in defending them in the court of international opinion, as well as legally, about the treatment of these people. And that sort of brought home a reality, which is that she was really a Burman politician, and the Burman population of Myanmar has deep feelings about the Rohingya for lots of old reasons, none of which are very appropriate. But she was responding to her constituency and the fact that the military is a Burman-run institution. It's not made up of a federal military system. It's a Burman system that was created after World War II, so that the Burman majority of the country could keep control over the whole country as best they could. And there's a deeper story there I'll try to get to later. So she was a Burman defending Burmans in the international and domestic arenas, and but that raised that sort of took her down a few pegs in the world in the view of many people about how committed she was to the principles of real human rights and things of that type. But they also ran into economic troubles, and they were having problems on the economy. They got hit by COVID, And in the beginnings of all of that, and the beginnings of the impact of these external things on their economy and on issues in their society. And they also in 1999, they made a move in the parliament, the NLD did, to have a change in the constitution that would make it more in line with what they wanted. And the military was able to push back significantly enough so that it failed. But it did reinforce the concern in the military that if the NLD got too much in control, they were going to change the system that the military had constructed that they felt that they could live with in sharing power with the NLD or other democratic forces. But I think it was a real shot across the bow to the fact that their system of control over things was being challenged in ways that were very uncomfortable. So when they got to the 2020 election, all these issues of COVID, of Rohingya, of the economy, of the impact of their efforts to change the constitution, really made the military very concerned about that election, which occurred in November 8th of 2020. And in that election, the NLD won even more seats than they had before. and so it really was an amazing result. And the military was taken quite by surprise because they thought that after with some of the problems of the previous 5 years that the military would do better and might even win in the 2020 election. And their plan was that if they won, that the head of their military would become the president, because he was getting close to being 65, which is a retirement age in the military, and he really wanted to be president. So on the day before they were going to seat the elected representatives in the new parliament, which was going to be the 2nd of February 2021, the day before the military pulled their coup. And they arrested Suu Kyi and other officials of the government who were about to be named into their positions, and under various claims of illegal activity. They made the claim that the election itself was not free and fair, and there had been corruption in the National Election Commission, which was not what the international community or the Election Commission claimed was true. And there had been, I would say, fairly heavily supervised elections by various foreigners, throughout the country to claim that the legitimacy of the election was solid. And basically, the military simply ignored all of that, claimed that this had been a mismanaged election, claimed that there had been now a national security crisis, and under the Constitution that gave the government the right to ask the military to take over temporarily to solve the issues of national security. And they used that as the rationale for the coup. Legally, I think the legal scholars who've looked at that say that what the Constitution actually says that the president of the country would invoke that clause of the Constitution and ask the military to step in for temporary control while they solve their problems. But the military just did it because they put the president-elect in jail, and there was no constitutional legal process that could justify what they did, and it is seen by legal scholars as an illegal coup, not permitted under the Constitution as it's currently written, which is why the political part of the old former government, for example, ambassadors and others who had authority under the old government, did not recognize the coup, and we know that their representative of the UN refused to step down and turn over the UN representative of Myanmar to a successor, and he still holds that seat because internationally and domestically the coup has not been recognized as a legitimate legal action. So that's kind of what happened during that period. So what are the underlying issues of this democratic transition? it was very difficult struggle that they've been engaged in to try to identify and establish democratic structures given the conflicting factions that exist in Myanmar with very different views of what they want to get out of a democracy. There have been allegations of election fraud all along the way. In the first election, the NLD could claim that there was a lot of corruption and fraud in the first election, and then the military claiming fraud in the later elections when the NLD did so well. The NLD victory raised the hopes of the people for a successful culmination of a democratic transition. There are a lot of people who don't really like the NLD much, but it is national, and they felt it would really make a difference if the NLD held power nationally, even if it wasn't something that they felt was meaningful in their own ethnic environment in whatever part of the country that they were in. But they really, a lot of people put a lot of hopes in the NLD for their own futures. And then along the way, one thing that was done that changed the game a little bit was the military had been given, under the Constitution, control over the Home Ministry, which handles all domestic police and security issues throughout the country, in addition to keeping control over the military itself and the ethnic border areas, which helped them keep control over everything. But there was a decision along the way to put the Home Ministry under civilian control, which basically put a lot of the administrative bureaucracy under civilian management rather than military management. And that was a concession the military made along the way that people felt was a step in the right direction. But again, this constitutional change was rebuffed. The controversy over Rohingya was out there, and is getting in the way of how do other parts of the country view these Burman interests in supporting the military over the Rohingya treatment. There are efforts throughout this process in trying to get peace talks between the military and various ethnic groups to make progress. And even under the NLD period, they just weren't able to get to any significant conclusions on that. And again, the very large margins of NLD wins in both 2015 and 2020 were seen by the military increasingly as threats to their control and their own economic interests. And the military, then this is something that many people don't know, but the military owns, basically controls two very large conglomerates of companies that make a ton of money for the country. And all the money flows into the military, not through the national budget. And the military has created a system of their own ability to manage monies for their own interest, independently of what the civilian government is trying to do. And it's that, and a lot of those assets of military assets, economic assets, are based in ethnic minority areas. The mining and the timbering, things that they can take out of the ground and sell to China and other countries. The military has wanted to keep control over those things, which also mean that there's an economic tension between the ethnic minorities who want more control over their own economic assets and the Burman majority that wants control over all of everybody's economic assets. And largely that's done through the military conglomerates. So that's been a major factor, and also a reason why they were so threatened by moving to an NLD managed democracy, which wanted to move into a very different direction of state enterprise reform and putting things under the control of the civilian administration, not under military ownership. So what happened after the election and the coup was there was a repudiation of the elections by the people in the coup very immediately. And the question is, who is this guy who had taken this over? This Min Aung Hlaing, who comes out of, no one really knew very much about him. For many years, the country had been dominated by Tan Shui, who retired back after the first election, and Min Aung Hlaing came up through the ranks. He was known in his domestic military experience as being willing to attack civilians in the way that they were dealing with ethnic minority resistance to military efforts to gain control in the ethnic areas, and particularly in the areas of the Karen and the Kachin and some of the parts of the Shan state and the Chin state. And he was known as someone who was willing to attack civilians, not just military armed groups. And also during the Rohingya effort, he was one of the people in charge of the attacks on the Rohingya and associated with the military's treatment of those people. So when he was put as the successor to Tan Shui, he had a lot of ambition for himself. As I said, he would have turned, well, he under military rule, you're supposed to step down at 65. He was ready, about to turn 65 in 2021, and when all of a sudden he realized that if NLD took over from these elections, he was going to have to step down as head of the military. So I think there are a lot of personal motivations for him to declare the coup and to take over and put himself in charge of what they call the State Administrative Council until they could, what they formally said at the time of the coup, arrange new elections by sometime before 2023, which I think no one is really expecting to happen at this stage. So he also, the other thing about him is he and his family have a major stake and control over one of the two big conglomerates of economic companies in the country. And so he's very closely wired to the money part of the tap and daw that is, which is really critical for their survival and existence as an independent military institution in a country that's now it's supposed to be coming under more and more civilian leadership and control. So he also recently, just within the last month, managed to give himself the two highest awards that you can ever give anybody in Myanmar, which is unheard of. And so there's a real ego trip going on in this new leader. And he obviously has very personal interests driving what he's been doing, not based on a larger strategy, but basically, I think, personally, he's looking after number one in all of this. So what have been some of the domestic responses to the coup? Well, first of all, what's really interesting is in a lot of the conflicts that we've seen before, it's the Burman military against various ethnic armed groups who were struggling for control over resources and ethnically homeland territories. But this time around, it was the Burman ethnic minority group, not just the ethnic minorities, and especially those in the major cities like Yangon and Mandalay and other parts of the Burman heartland, who refused to accept the election. And this is the first time that there's been any kind of major popular pushback against the military that I know of. There have been smaller pushbacks, but this is a major pushback within the Burman ethnic majority group, and that's different from anything that we've seen before. And the second thing that's different is the younger generation is totally intolerant of this coup. And back in the 1990s, 90s and 80s, they basically shut the universities and shut down a whole generation of people from having access to higher education. And it was a hugely destructive period in social capital for the country, both educationally and health-wise, under military management. And the young generation is now used to making money, of being innovative. They've all got cell phones and they've all got access to the internet, and they have Facebook, and they have no interest at all in going back into a world where the military suppresses everybody. And if there's anything that is going to have staying power in this resistance going forward, it's the younger generation not giving up or acquiescing to what the military wants them to do. The other groups that participated in this response were civil servants and service providers, people in the banks and the hospitals and government ministries who didn't want to be associated with a government run by the military, who have stepped away from those jobs, and so wanting to be part of the resistance and not to strengthen the opportunity of the government to maintain control over things. And that's what made life even more difficult for the general population, because they need the services from hospitals and banks and places, but they don't want, these civil servants don't want to be associated. And then, of course, the ethnic minority groups and various armed militias that exist in the rural areas and the ethnic minority areas. And there are ones that have been well established for many years and that have had conflicts with the military off and on. But there are also new ones that have been created simply as a result of the coup, where people are particularly untrained resistors who want to use force to try to push back on the military. So there have been this rise of confrontational groups, both in the cities and in the rural areas, that are new and are not the same as they were before. And then you have the military leaders and what they've been pushing for, the military officers and soldiers, and the religious communities who have been trying to provide safe havens for people whose villages and whose livelihoods have been impacted by the effort of the military to include civilian protesters and not just armed protesters in the way that they've responded to the resistance of the people. So just a very quick look at the map, and I'll be very quick here, but I want to just say that Myanmar is made up of these ethnic homeland areas. So this area here is various groups of Karen, and there are different categories of Karen, but they are a long-standing group that has been in antagonistic relationship with the military for decades. And the same in the Kachin up on the China border. The Kachin have a very strong independent streak and have had conflict ongoing with the military. In the Shan state, there are a whole bunch of different groups in the Shan state that have links to China, many of them, and they have other ways of earning money. A lot of the opium and the drug trafficking from the old Golden Triangle was located in these areas, pretty much out of control of any central government system. And then more recently in the Sagang, in this area of the Chin, this is an area where there's a lot of resistance and confrontation right now. And over in the west, on the Bangladesh border, this is the Rakhine state and the Arakan army, which is very sophisticated. And what we're seeing right now is the military is dealing with resistance and military and armed groups throughout the country. Usually they were fighting one group at a time, more or less. Now they're fighting everybody, and there's resistance in this area, the Saigon and the Chin, in the Kachin area, in the Shan state. A lot of resistance in the Karen areas and over in the Rakhine area. So, and now also they're dealing with resistance in the cities, in Yangon, in Bago, in Magaway, not in Naypyidaw is the city, the capital that was built by the military. It's like an enclave for the military as the capital now. But Mandalay, which is the traditional capital of the Burmans, all of these cities in the Burman heartland are sources of conflict with the military. So they're being stretched very thin on very many different fronts. And they haven't had to deal with that ever in the way that in the many years that they've run this country. So these are just a few photographs. These are the urban resistance fighters, the little armed groups that have created in many of the cities to confront in the urban environment, the police and in the armed forces. There's the younger group who are out there protesting loudly and frequently on all kinds of occasions of the non-acceptance of this coup and the government. These are health workers who are saying that they are part of the resistance movement and that they want to be associated with that. They don't want to be seen as health workers to be involved with the military at all. Then you have the traditional armed groups in the Karen and Kachin and other areas, which are well armed, well trained, and often very successful in the way that they confront the Tatmadaw militarily. And then you've got these young people who have moved from the cities to the rural areas for training and to deciding to leave their jobs, even leave their families, to go and be trained and become involved in the militarized armed conflict, joining with the ethnic minority groups to strengthen the resistance against the regime. And this is something that's unprecedented in my knowledge. And here is a picture of one of Kitty's friends, Hezero, who was a priest up in one of the Karen areas in the eastern part of the country. And she's supporting his church and has been for a while, as he's had preschools and other English language programs for people living in the area. But he's been turned his church also into a clinic to help them with COVID, and being able to get medicine and things to him is one of the things that she's been doing, helping Hezro and others like him get access to resources so that they can provide services to their people in their areas that aren't getting served by other hospitals and things, and given the situation that they're in. And then the military is out, roaming the way they do and setting fire not just to military targets, but to villages, and bombings using airplanes particularly, and making major damage in rural settings, including churches and even Buddhist temples occasionally, and mosques. So what are as I said, some of the dynamics of these fightings are the urban protests and street fighting. And recently there have been stories of attacks on senior administrative officials. And this is something, for example, just a couple of weeks ago, the vice governor of the central bank was attacked after the central bank announced a policy that all people had to take any bank accounts they had with foreign money in them and turn them into local currency and give the foreign money back to the government. And there is a huge anger and resistance against this because the government's running out of foreign exchange, and that's the economic troubles facing the regime after the coup are mounting daily. And the ways that they're trying to deal with that are getting resistance, not just in protests, but attacks on officials and people who were linked to military-owned families. And one of the things that's happened that is really, I think, interesting is that there have been a migration of people from the cities who had been linked to these senior administrative offices, their families, or to the military officers, to them leaving Yangon and leaving Mandalay and moving to Naypyidaw, where they'd be safer under the protection of the military. But that sort of migration is really unprecedented. And now the housing prices up in the Naypyidaw area are very high. And it's very interesting that people are leaving their home cities of places like Yangon because they're frightened of what the local people are going to do to them. And there have been all kinds of boycotts of military-owned businesses and special industry, other holidays, and increasingly attacks on Chinese businesses. Not only things like textile mills in the Yangon area, but more recently there are threats against Chinese-owned mines up in the Saigang area, and pipelines that carry gas and oil from the west coast up into Yunnan province that go through all these ethnic areas in the west and the northern parts of the country that are very vulnerable to attacks. And the local groups in these areas are saying to the Chinese, if you are supporting the military, we're going to take your assets in this country as fair game to attack your business interests in our country. And I think there are some real risks associated with the implications of how that could play out. We can talk more about. Again, there's been a lot of mobilization of ethnic armed resistance and increasingly offensive strikes by the resistance groups, not just playing defense against the military. They're playing offense now in a number of different ways. And the urban youth moving the jungles, I've talked about. The fact that there are a lot of civilian attacks on people, not just military. Military even attacking religious safe havens. And this is leading to a very large growth in the number of internally displaced people needing shelter and people heading for the border areas, particularly in Thailand, to seek refuge in refugee camps on the border or in Thailand. But what's interesting about all of this is the growth of information technology. Everybody has cell phones and access to the internet and ways to get around the way the government's trying to control access to the internet, which allows communication among the resistance groups in a way that was never possible before. And they're communicating with each other, coordinating information in ways that are unprecedented and new challenges for the way the military's responded. So after 1 year, what is the impact of all of this? Well, there have been more than 1,300 deaths. There have been more than 11,000 civilians arrested. The estimation of IDPs is about 400,000, but Human Rights Watch is saying it's closer to 550,000. There are fires in villages, buildings, churches. The poverty rate has reached 46% of the population below poverty line if you add both the coup and the impact of COVID, whereas in 2017, that baseline was 25%. The GDP declined in 2021 by 18%, according to the bank. And there's a great need for humanitarian assistance now. Of over almost 14.5 million people need direct humanitarian assistance. And there have been a variety of coping strategies that have been adopted by the people, but by far the largest is just reducing food consumption and eating less food is the way that most people are trying to adapt to the current situation. So what have been the political responses to confront the military? First, there was a formation of a national unity government, which is seeking support internationally and domestically for recognition of its legitimacy. There's an increased focus on coordinating resistance strategies among different armed groups and ethnic leaders in different parts of the country, which has never really happened before. But if the different armed groups in the different parts of the country coordinate their strategies against the military, that would be a very significant change in the way things have been in the past. And they're also establishing coordination consultation councils at both national and local state levels, where they get the armed groups, civil society, and local administration working and talking with each other about how they can adapt and manage in their own areas in ways that are not requiring national level support from a government that they don't want to work with. And in some areas, establishing people's administrations where there's just no public administration except what they can do for themselves locally. As I mentioned earlier, there's the UN ambassador has retained his position and largely being supported by the membership of the UN. And the NUG is offering cash payments for defections from the military with increasing success. And of course, they're appealing for the arms community for arms embargo and efforts by the UN Security Council, and they have one already from the General Assembly, focusing international attention on the issues of Myanmar and the need for support for the people. So quickly, the responses of the international community. The private sector has largely pulled up stakes because of both because of COVID and the coup, and a lot of private companies, including ones involved in the oil and gas sector, have left the country and said that they don't want to be part of this. And that includes, in the last week, a number of energy companies from Asia, from Japan, Malaysia, and Singapore. So those are all, this private sector response is very real on the economic side. ASEAN has been conflicted, as I think many people know, but there are countries within ASEAN that really care about what's going on. And I would say Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, maybe the Philippines are the ones that really feel that the military's gone way out of line in the way they are dealing with things. Singapore particularly has a lot of leverage. It is the largest foreign investor in Myanmar and is a place where most of the military puts their money when they're putting it outside the country and where they go for doctor's appointments and things like that. So there have been efforts to lean on Singapore to be tougher with the military than they have been. China has been aligning itself more with the military than with the opposition groups recently, but they're very compromised because of these the assets that they have in the country and the number of Chinese that have moved into the northern part of the country that could be threatened by the resistance movement, both economically in terms of the Chinese population, if the people turn against them. So they're in an awkward position. Russia was their closest friend, supplier of military equipment, but the war in Ukraine is changing the dynamic. It's hard to tell that the Russians are going to be able or want to be able to supply this kind of weapons that the military needs to keep up what they're trying to do to suppress the population. The U.S. does what the U.S. always does and puts sanctions on everybody and using a lot of jawboning, but there's been very little formal support that has been visible to helping the resistance movement. Japan and Korea are both big investors in Myanmar and have a significant economic relationship. Both of them are feeling that because they're democracies, they have to be on the side of the angels of what's going on here. But because they have economic interests, they are also very cautious about how they sacrifice their positioning there. And they're a little, I would say, they're a little somewhat conflicted in the way they're responding to this. And the UN, the Security Council is a nothing burger right now because Russia and China are both not supporting any kind of resolutions in the Security Council that would have an impact on Myanmar globally. But the General Assembly, where they did bring a resolution to the floor, has been supportive of the opposition and has continued to recognize the earlier representative of the country. So the deeper story is that way back in the 1930s, the Tatmadaw originated under military training from the British during the 1930s, and Aung San, who became the father of the military, and many of the senior generals that took over during the Ne Win period all came out of that era of British training, so that the Tatmadaw became a very formidable institution that along with the Buddhist Sangha, the monks, was the only two institutions which were really national in scope. And otherwise, most of the institutions that were inherited from the British in terms of civil administration and law sort of broke down fairly quickly into Burman-led institutions that were able to keep a significant national presence. And it has its roots, as I mentioned earlier, in the divide and rule strategy of the British, keeping the different ethnic groups separated from each other rather than integrating them in a national coherence during the colonial period. Aung San, who was considered the father of the country, brokered independence from the British. And I won't go into a lot of detail about that, but he was assassinated in 1947 before they could really form a government that could legitimately take charge. And when they did form a government of elected officials in the early 1950s, they really were unsuccessful in getting control of the country. And there was only a period of there where only about 5% of the land was safe from various insurgencies, including a communist insurgency that spread throughout the country. So in the late 1950s, they asked the military to come in and help stabilize things, give the Tatmadaw a mission to help stabilize the country before handing back to democratic leadership. But then when Ne Win just came in 1962 and just had a complete coup and installed a completely military-dominated government in 1962 that succeeded all the way up into the democratic election of 2010. I won't go into detail onto the failed transition to democracy in 1990, but the elections that I mentioned earlier, when the military refused to accept them, that led to a long period of Suu Kyi being put in house arrest and tension between the succeeding military governments and the emergent anti-military or pro-democracy movements, not just in the NLD, but in the student group that uprising of 1988, who really wanted to be much more proactive in challenging the military. And the 1990s up until 2010 was a very confused and conflicted period in their history. The autocracy is part of the Burman culture, and it's not just the Tatmadaw that are autocratic. Suu Kyi has an autocratic personality herself, and she's a kind of do it my way or the highway type of a leader, even within the NLD. And she did almost nothing to encourage the development of younger leaders in the NLD or in other ways, so that when they took over the National Assembly, they did not have a younger generation of leadership that they were nurturing for the future. And I think that was one of the biggest mistakes of the NLD during the period that they had a control over things. And as I said before, the Tatmadaw really is Burman dominated. It has focused on control of security. They have all this money, and it's been a mechanism where younger, ambitious people could join the military and raise through the ranks and make money and have status. So it's functioned as a state within a state, where the civilian state was left pretty much on its own for decades, while the Tatmadaw was keeping control and feathering its own nest. So very quickly, recent developments. The military's been challenged by the fighting on all these fronts, plus the urban areas simultaneously. This movement of military links from families to Naypyidaw, from Yangon and other places, says that things are not well in the military community. The impact of the war in Ukraine on military support from Russia and the arms sales that they were actually getting from Ukraine are probably meaning that the military has less access and less attention from Russia than it did before the Ukraine war. But it's also diverted attention from Myanmar to Ukraine and the whole international community, in a fear that they're sort of getting lost in the shuffle there. What's interesting is there have been increasing defections of both mid-level officers and soldiers who are uncomfortable with what's going on, the way the military is relating to ordinary people. Lang giving himself all these awards and sort of feathering his own nest and sending mixed messages, and saying on the one hand he's going to go after all these different groups, but he also called for a peace meeting with ethnic armed armies, but that call has been rejected by them. And Suu Kyi also managed to get a message out from her cell calling for national unity, and encouraging people to talk with each other and form a unity separate from the military. And then the weakened economy and the growing social instability are just creating an environment where things are not looking well, particularly for the military or for the or for the people. So I'm going to end with just a question: is there a path towards a national reinvention of democracy and as a nation state? And I think that one of the themes is there's a growing unsustainability of the Tatmadaw as an isolated, self-centered institution. And there's a disintegration emerging, and a question about how long it's going to be able to sustain itself in an environment that is not allowing its normal way of functioning to continue. There's this determination of the younger generation to resist capitulation. There's a possibility of more coherent pressure of support from key countries for the resistance organizations, particularly from Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, South Korea, Japan, India, Thailand, and hopefully the United States. There is a question about whether there might be a coup from within the military, and there's a lot of precedent in Myanmar history for that sort of internal adjustment within the military itself. And that I would not say is out of the question. And then there's a question of a deepening role of what is called the National Unity Consultative Commission, which has been created in conjunction with the National Unity Government that's conducting inclusive dialogue regularly over Zoom and trying to build foundations for trust for a collaborative federal system, which involves all the different major ethnic groups and their different homeland areas where they exercise primary control without the participation of the Tatmadaw, and finding whether there are seeds for a new way of thinking about how they could function more federally if they are able to get through transition with the Tatmadaw without controlling everything. And there has been some demonstrated success at the state level. So I think there are some glimmerings of optimism for a solution to the Myanmar situation that comes from within and not dictated from outside by us or anyone else, if they have the support and the strength to see their way through it. And it's a real challenge for nation building to take a country with so many diverse ethnic groups and deprive them of a military framework of maintaining control, but giving them the opportunity to have a creative regeneration of what it means to be a citizen of this country. So with that, I think I'll stop my screen share. And that gives us a little time for other discussion. But let me just ask Kitty if you want to say a couple of words about some of your perspectives. You're muted.
Let me just add briefly something about the role of the churches in all of this, that the population is overwhelmingly Buddhist, of course, but there's a substantial number of Muslims in the country, most of whom came in under British rule from the India side to help the British manage their colony. And many animists in particular under the British converted to Christianity. And the churches have since played a remarkable role in that they've served all the people. They have not just served their own, particularly in the distanced areas where Yangon, which used to be the primary center of power before Naypyidaw was built. In the distant areas, people collaborated much more than at the center, because no one was watching, and because the needs of the people were of such significance that collaboration was important. So I think the churches under the British had a substantial role in educational facilities. There were mission schools where children learned English and were highly educated, many of whom are now in their 70s and 80s, but have very good memories of the quality of education they were given under them. The one handicap that the Anglican Church had, which, and I am, as an Episcopalian, a member of the Anglican Communion, is that when the British came in, they first came in as merchants. The East India Company was invested in taking out timber and gemstones and other goods from the land. And so the merchants came in first, and then they brought in their military to manage the colony. And then the missionaries followed, sent out from England, from Lambeth, to service only their own, the British, who were working as in the military and in the East India Company. So the Burmans speak of the Anglicans as the 3 M's, the merchants, military, and missionaries, and were much more open to the other religious entities that served all the people, the Baptists being primary. what's true today is that the Baptists are a powerhouse within the Christian groups because they have been supported primarily by the Americans, the American church, and they have they've sent many people to the United States for education, and they've gone back and strengthened those kinds of alliances. For myself, but the Baptists have not, they do not yet have female ministers, though their women have had very powerful positions leading their educational institutions. So as a woman priest, which is considered on a par with a Buddhist monk, I was and continue to be a real fascination point. And it actually has been a great advantage because that fascination leads them to want to talk more with me and what I think, because they don't think they're going to get the same old response. So I've been able to be a camel's nose under the tent in some very interesting circumstances, one of which was an interview set up by UNICEF with a young Buddhist interviewer who made sure that the whole thing was recorded. But it was my opportunity as a Christian to point out what the similarities between Buddhism and Christianity are, and to try to break through some of the negative opinion that the Buddhist majority and the Buddhist military had of the Christian community. And that, I think, is still available somewhere online. But my Christian friends were very happy about where that went to soften what their own problems continue to be with the Buddhist military leadership. I have, as Brad said, supported projects in Burma, Myanmar, and with the help of friends who have also been generous. And you may be curious to know that I send my money in by Western Union, which is easy, it's quick. I take cash to their outlets here, and within minutes, it's available to my friends inside Myanmar. And that does a lot of good, as Brad pointed out, in particular, building up service opportunities for some of the poor in distant areas. At the moment, my friends have had a hard time. I have an Anglican bishop friend who, upon retirement, ran for election as a parliamentarian under the NLD flag. He was elected, and of course, when the military took over, he had to hide himself and his family in a village, and has since walked over the mountains to one of the refugee camps in Thailand, where he is officially stateless. There are a lot of people like him who have lost everything to this coup. So what else can I tell you about the situation? I will say, some people say, why were the people in Burma, Myanmar so apparently docile for so long? And I think one reason is that guns, obviously, and the financial power of the military, but also at what I call the street level of Buddhist belief, people believe that their situation is the result of their karmic balance, if you will. So if one is poor and struggling, then that is popularly understood to be the wages of past sin, we would say, in Christian understanding. But the Christians are seen as dangerous to the Burmans because they've absolved them of that accumulated sin over eons. It's all a new start in Christ. and therefore they are willing to say things and make steps that are contrary to what the Buddhist extremist military wants from popular consent. Notably, the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Myanmar has been extremely outspoken, couched in gospel language, much the way Pope Francis would, but has been an important voice of challenge to the military. So the Christian voice has a notable authority in Myanmar, and I have not been back for 3 years, of course, because of COVID and because of the coup. So hopefully, if things calm down a bit, I'll go back next year, where I teach and preach and do whatever friends would have me do. My latitude for travel has been extraordinary because I go in on a tourist visa. My Christian friends take care of me. I do not have to sign in as an NGO does for official permission to go to some of the outlying areas. So I've had a remarkable opportunity to see distant parts of the country, to listen to the people, to discern what their hopes are for the future, and to help them as I'm able. So Brad and I are an interesting couple. He deals with the sort of the politics and economics, and I deal with the spiritual and religious realm. And between the two of us, we cover a lot of bases.
Well, I think we have a few minutes for comments. If anyone would like a question or a comment, just use the raise your hand function. Yeah, please.
Go ahead, Bob. You're muted, Bob.
I wonder is there a language that most of the people in the country know so that they can be productive communication? Is that English, or what language would that be?
Burmese.
So okay. So there is one central, because there are probably 100 different dialects and that sort of thing. Yes.
That's true, but it's one of the few countries in Asia where you can go almost anywhere as an English speaker and find an ability to find people who speak English. So, and that's derivative of their history, but they have a culture that's deeply rooted in literacy. It's you know, if you go on a train, there are people, you know, coming by with magazines and books. So you go by people's houses and they're filled with, in the evening, reading books and filled with libraries. The monk schools go back, primary education in Myanmar was probably the best in Asia for many years, because at the Buddhist temples around the country, the monks would collect the children and they would teach them their 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. And so they had a highly literate population even before the British arrived. It's very unusual. If you go to Thailand, it's a very different situation. Anyone else?
Other thoughts or comments?
Yes,
John?
please.
John Sautier?
The looming shortfall in energy. And so are there other
I guess I got it. Was there ever any real tourist trade to Burma? As I suppose there's not a lot right now because of COVID, et cetera. Is it a place where you'd love to visit?
Oh, it's a wonderful place to visit. And there's just, yeah, and I mean, it's just amazing culture. The Buddhist culture is in itself is fascinating, and the you know, the Shwedagon Pagoda was famous, and there are beautiful places throughout the country, and the people are wonderful. I mean, it's a very comfortable place to travel. I've never felt physically threatened there, even though we've been there in some very awkward situations. So and I think it's a wonderful place to travel. You know, for many years it was so isolated, and they were that their infrastructure for tourism was very small. But that's changed a lot in the last 20 years, the last 15 years. There's been a lot of investment in ecotourism there, and in hotels and various things. So yeah, I would say if things ever get back into a positive political, economic environment, definitely put it on your list of places to go.
Mhm.
The people are extremely generous in spirit. I've never faced any animosity either.
Okay, I have Tim and then Dory.
Hi, wonderful presentation. Thank you. I was wondering what your ideas of how America, how the US and perhaps Europe should be involved, and how much ASEAN, the other ASEAN countries should be involved, and what would China's response be?
Well, I think that the U.S. is ramping up its desire to be involved, because as we talk about the sort of the conflict between authoritarianism and freedom, democracy, this is a country which matters in that larger agenda, and to ignore it, I think, for this administration is out of sync with what their very larger story was, including with China and with Russia, both of whom have good relationships with the military side of this. And we've supported Suu Kyi from the very beginning. I mean, while she was incarcerated, and put a lot of pressure through sanctions on the earlier military government, which were only lifted after the NLD took over the parliament back in 2015. It's pretty recent that all of those sanctions we put on were actually lifted. But I think the question is, in what are the levers that the U.S. government can have that will actually make a difference? And there, I think the issue is, how do you support these homegrown efforts to get more process of integration of coordinated thinking and strategy and resources to support them, both militarily against the government, but even more so to nurture and encourage their ability to shape their own future. And I'm not sure what the answer is going to be there, because of the lack of travel, and I don't think our formal legal, formal diplomatic presence carries much weight in the current environment. But I think it's really important. They are supporting, they're very encouraging of people doing what Kitty's doing, which is finding connectivity and supporting people, make them feel that the rest of the world knows them and cares about them, wants to help them. That encouragement is probably the most important thing that being given that country right now. Dory.
I just wanted to second your recommendation for travel. I was lucky enough to get there just before COVID hit, and it is a beautiful country. We did Inlay Lake for a day and traveled around by this boat. It's very shallow. Saw how they fish, which they've been doing that way for about 1,000 years, and silver making and pounding gold blocks into gold leaf and weaving. And the highlight of the trip, we did Cambodia and Thailand and Myanmar. The highlight was the balloon ride over the temples of Bagan at dawn.
I've done that too.
Yes. Yeah, it's pretty special out there in Bagan. Joe, you had another question?
Yes, Brad, I wanted to ask you, what makes you think that Myanmar could be a nation state? In other words, if you were creating nation states, would you have created Myanmar with all those different ethnic groups, et cetera?
Well, they've been cohabiting the same geography for about 3,000 years. And if you look back at maps of that area, it looks like an amoeba over time. As one gets more control over territory, squeezes another out, back and forth. But they're well-established homeland areas, and they've lived both in this geography together, but they commingle in the cities. And as Kitty says, when no one's looking, they actually cooperate with each other. Okay, when it's not political. And I mean, one of her bishops, Wilmie's best friends, is a Muslim, and they figure out how to make money together. And when the Muslim population in Taungoo was attacked by the military, and everyone was hiding and their homes were burning, he took them all into his compound and sheltered them in Taungoo while they were to give them safety. So there is some remarkable, because of the life that they've led, the history they all share. Yes, there are different ethnic groups. The question is whether they could find their own way of living together that isn't dominated by the Burman majority. I think that's the big question.
But I would add to that before the British came and used divide and conquer strategies to contain the historically aggressive Burman majority, all of those groups, as Brad said, lived together quite amicably. But the British set the Burmans against the ethnic groups and befriended the ethnic groups whose homelands were in the surround of the Burman central landscape. So that's where the divisions entered in. Aung San Suu Kyi's father had worked with the British to establish a federalist arrangement where these groups would collaborate politically and have jurisdiction over their own native homelands. But when he was assassinated, all that went down the tubes. The irony is, I think, that today, because of what the junta has done, the Burman majority, primarily the young, have turned against that design of Burmese supremacy and are willing to throw their lot in with these other groups. They're willing, for the first time, really to acknowledge that what happened to the Rohingya was just heinous. So that there is, as the NUG is working to accomplish a new collaboration, which in many ways harkens back to what existed before. So we'll see. One point that I think is interesting about the NUG, though, is their leadership. They're all in hiding, and they're working from locations that are kept secret for their own security reasons. So we have to hope that, you know, that survives and that they can continue safely to do this good work of bringing these groups together in new ways, which are actually ancient.
Yeah, and I would just add to that traditionally in the Burman political world, it goes way back, their politics is one of zero-sum game. Yeah. The idea of compromise is not part of the Burman political mentality. So this tension between Aung San Suu Kyi and the Tatmadaw that goes all the way back to the 1990 elections and the authoritarianism that she had within the NLD and that they have within the military, and their inability to compromise to be able to come up with a solution that would allow elections that would actually work. Military wasn't willing to compromise even in drafting that new constitution when they were ready to go down a democratic transition. They didn't compromise with the NLD or Suu Kyi. So this idea that politics and leadership is a zero-sum game has been a big part of their problem. And right now the challenge is whether they can overcome that, as Kitty says, and be into a more collaborative and compromised kind of environment of managing their affairs together. And that would be a sea change of political life in the country if that was to come about.
And I would say about that the young people look primarily to the United States as a model of of how to be collaborative now. At the moment, it certainly doesn't look like we're managing that very well, but historically, that we've been seen as, a leader in this way. And that historical identity has been what the young people have always looked to as a model for their hope for their own future.
Plus, we took a bunch of colonies and beat the British.
Yes, we have that in common.
Well, I know we're past time, but I don't know whether if others have any more comments. I think we're pretty well finished with our time. I don't know.
Joe, did you still have your hand up, or that's a leftover? Okay, it's a
No,
leftover.
that's leftover.
Okay. Thank you. This is very informative and thorough, and again, just highlights what it means to be part of this community that is the World Affairs Council of Maine, because we have all of this expertise. I mean, how often do you get 15 people together and find that, 4 or 5 of them have been to Myanmar or places close by? It's quite, and had meaningful experiences there. It's quite extraordinary. Coffee and discussion on Thursday. Don't forget, we're going to talk about the French and Slovenian elections. It's a virtual meeting, so Bob can come. No, we always have our virtual coffee and discussion group the first Thursday of the month. And I'm really excited to talk about the French and Slovenian elections in contrast to the Hungarian elections, because it looks like, there's some sensible countries in Europe that are not going to go down the soft authoritarian path. And next week we have space. We'll be hearing from John Dowdy talking about the outer space chapter for Great Decisions. So thank you everyone for being here. Brad and Kitty, thank you again for sharing your expertise, and we'll see you all next week, if not before on Thursday. Thank you so much and have a great evening.
Thank you all. We
Thank you,
appreciate the
everyone.
opportunity to be with you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Good night.
Good night.